Sarah Chen had always believed that retirement would feel like liberation. 23 years of 5 a.m. wake-ups, of missing dinners with her ex-husband before he became her ex, of holidays spent working cases instead of celebrating them. She'd earned the right to be free. Her captain had told her so. Her therapist had told her so. The polished plaque sitting in a box in her car, commemorating her service, seemed to confirm it. Yet here she stood at her own retirement party, barely 40 minutes in, and she felt more trapped than she'd ever felt in a patrol car. The Riverside Community Center's gymnasium had been transformed into something that tried desperately to be festive. Blue and gold balloons, the police department's colors, hung from the ceiling on strings that made them bob like jellyfish in an unseen current. A banner reading, CONGRATULATIONS, Sarah CHEN, 23 years of service, stretched across the back wall in letters that seemed both celebratory and accusatory. Tables laden with sheet cake, sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, and punch bowls filled with a liquid that tasted like fruit had given up hope lined the perimeter of the gym. Nearly 200 people filled the space, police officers past and present, FBI colleagues she'd worked with on major cases, K-9 handlers from 3 counties. Even her ex-husband had shown up, which was either the height of civility or the deepest kind of awkwardness. Sarah hadn't decided which yet. Duke, her 8-year-old golden retriever, had worn his working harness for the occasion, though technically he was off-duty now too. The dog was magnificent in the way only a veteran working animal could be, calm, observant, completely unfazed by the noise and chaos around him. His coat, brushed to a shine that took Sarah 40 minutes that morning, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Several people had already tried to pet him, and Duke had accepted their affection with the patient grace of a dog who understood that human touch was part of the job, even if the job was supposed to be over. Sarah had spent the last hour making small talk that felt like slowly sinking into wet sand, conversations about what she'd do next, comments about how she'd earned her rest, questions about whether Duke would enjoy retirement as much as she would. Everyone meant well. Everyone was trying to celebrate her. Everyone was inadvertently highlighting the things Sarah was trying desperately not to think about. What came next? She'd been a police officer since she was 25 years old. She defined herself by the job so completely that removing the job felt like removing her own skin. Duke, at least, had no such existential crisis. He would be fine. Dogs lived in the present, unburdened by questions about identity and purpose, and the aching fear that maybe, just maybe, she'd spent her entire adult life on something that would turn out to be temporary. That's when she noticed the little girl. She was small enough that Sarah almost missed her entirely, wedged into the corner behind the donation table like a piece of furniture someone had forgotten. Her dress was pink, faded to the color of old cotton candy, with a tear along the seam that had been repaired with thread that didn't quite match. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her feet, bare except for socks that had once been white, didn't quite reach the floor as she sat in an adult-sized folding chair that swallowed her whole. Maya Reeves. Sarah recognized her immediately, though they'd never met. The news coverage had been inescapable 2 weeks ago. The Amber Alert that had consumed the local airways, the desperate pleas from her parents, the grainy photo from a security camera showing a man and a child near Highway 9, the eventual discovery of the girl alone on a rural road, dehydrated and silent. Completely, absolutely silent. The girl wasn't crying. She wasn't playing with anything or interacting with anyone. She was simply sitting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something that existed only in her own mind. Every few seconds, her body would give a small shudder, like she was trying to shake something off but couldn't quite manage it. Sarah felt something twist in her chest, that old familiar sensation that had driven her to become a cop in the first place. The desire to fix things, the need to make broken things whole again. Maya's parents were supposed to be here, Sarah had seen them arrive, embraced by well-wishers, looking shell-shocked in the way of people who'd survived a hurricane and couldn't quite believe they were still standing. But they'd stepped away to get food or use the restroom, leaving their daughter unattended in that corner, isolated and small, surrounded by strangers in a room designed to celebrate. Sarah had been about to move toward the girl when Duke shifted his weight beside her. The dog had been trained for narcotics, search and rescue, and cadaver detection, but he had a secondary skill that Sarah had never put in an official report. He seemed to sense when people were in emotional distress. It was as if something in his ancient, evolved canine brain could detect the specific frequency of human suffering. His ears perked up. His dark eyes tracked across the gymnasium, moving past the celebrating officers, past the laughing detectives, directly to the small figure in the corner. Sarah watched her partner rise to his feet. "Duke, heel," she said instinctively, but her hand didn't tighten on the lead. Instead, she found herself relaxing her grip, curious about where he was going, why he was going, what he'd sensed that her human perception had merely noted as sad rather than dangerous. The dog approached slowly, the way he'd been trained to approach distressed individuals. His body language was non-threatening, his head lowered, his pace deliberate and gentle. Several people turned to watch, smiling at what they assumed was the retired police dog simply making his rounds at the party. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't social nicety. This was Duke operating from some deep place of instinct and intelligence that existed beneath language. Maya didn't flinch when Duke approached. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the interaction. The girl showed no fear, no wariness, no reaction at all. She simply watched as the massive golden retriever lowered his head to her eye level, his eyes soft and somehow understanding. And then slowly, the girl's small hand came up. Her fingers were trembling. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. Her skin was pale in a way that suggested minimal time in sunlight, though Sarah knew from the news reports that the girl had been found outdoors. But this trembling, this damage to the nails, this suggested she'd been inside, kept somewhere dark and small and wrong. Maya's hand touched Duke's fur. The moment that happened, Sarah felt the air in the gymnasium shift. It was subtle. Not everyone would have noticed it. But Sarah had spent 2 decades reading rooms, reading people, reading situations with the precision of someone whose life had sometimes depended on it. Something had changed. "Police dog," Maya whispered. The voice was so quiet that Sarah almost thought she'd imagined it, but the rest of the gymnasium had gone still. Conversations had stopped. People had turned to look. In the sudden silence, every sound became crystalline clear. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft padding of Duke's breathing, the almost inaudible whisper of a 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken since the day she was found. Sarah's heart began to hammer. This was impossible. According to every social worker, every therapist, every expert who'd been consulted about Maya's case, the girl was locked in by trauma so profound that language itself had become inaccessible to her. She showed no signs of understanding speech. She didn't respond to her own name. She existed in a state of profound psychological withdrawal from which recovery was uncertain. And yet here she was, speaking, recognizing the dog, identifying it as something specific and meaningful rather than simply responding to its physical presence. "Police dog find him," Maya continued, her voice gaining something that might have been strength or might have been the temporary breaking of a dam that had held back something vast and terrible. Sarah felt her legs move without conscious permission. She was walking toward Maya now, her entire body operating on instinct and training, and the knowledge that she was about to hear something that would change everything. Maya's eyes met Sarah's, and what the older woman saw there made her breath catch. This wasn't a traumatized child simply reaching out. This was a child with information. This was a child who'd been waiting for the right moment, the right signal, the right presence to trigger the release of words she'd been holding captive inside herself. "Police dog find him where he hide," Maya said, still stroking Duke's soft fur, her small hand moving in circles as if the physical contact was what was giving her access to language, as if touch was the key that unlocked her voice. Sarah knelt down slowly, moving into the child's space carefully, aware that every eye in the gymnasium was now on them. Behind her, she could hear someone pulling out a phone, recording. The moment was being captured, would soon be broadcast, would become evidence and testimony, and the beginning of something larger than any of them understood. "Police dog can't sniff in the dark," Maya continued, her voice still quiet but now with an eerie clarity, a precision of memory that suggested she was repeating words she'd heard, absorbing language like a sponge, storing it without processing it until this exact moment when she needed it. But the police dog could. The police dog could find him. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to parse meaning from a child's fragmented speech, trying to understand what hiding place she was describing, what basement or crawlspace or dark corner of the world had held this small person captive, while she memorized the voice of her abductor. "What's his name?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice level and gentle the way she'd learned to speak to victims. "The person you're talking about, what's his name?" Maya's hand stilled on Duke's fur. Her eyes, which had been focused on the dog, flickered upward to meet Sarah's. And in that moment, the child opened her mouth to speak the name of the monster who'd taken her, the name that would unleash an entire investigation, the name that would eventually lead to a basement that shouldn't have existed and bodies that shouldn't have been found. But that moment, the moment before she spoke, that was when everything balanced on a knife's edge. That was when the silence before the revelation hung like a held breath before a scream. That was when Sarah Chen, 6 hours into her retirement, understood that she would never actually get to retire at all. "Derek," Maya whispered, her small voice barely audible even in the now silent gymnasium. "Derek the man." The name hung in the air like poison gas, invisible but lethal, spreading through the room and infecting everyone who heard it. Sarah felt her body go rigid. Around her, phones were already out, messages were being typed. The police apparatus was beginning to mobilize based on a single word from a 3-year-old girl. But Sarah knew something that most of the people in that gymnasium didn't know yet. Derek Hollins had already been arrested. He'd been arrested 11 days ago, exactly 6 days after Maya was found on Highway 9. The arrest had made the news, a quiet, almost anticlimactic story buried beneath headlines about election year politics and celebrity scandals. Derek Hollins, local carpenter, questioned in connection with the abduction of Maya Reeves, released on bail pending further investigation. No charges filed yet. Insufficient evidence for prosecution. He was currently living in his house on Maple Street, free as a bird, while the police department fumbled their way through a case that had more holes than actual evidence. Sarah's mind was already several steps ahead of her body. She understood immediately what this moment meant. A child's testimony, even a child who hadn't spoken in months, was powerful. Juries loved children. Children were innocent, pure, incapable of lying in the sophisticated ways adults could lie. But in court, a defense attorney would tear Maya apart. They would argue that she'd been coached, that she'd overheard conversations, that her account was contaminated by adult suggestion. Unless there was physical evidence to back it up. Unless there was something concrete, something undeniable, something that a 3-year-old couldn't possibly know unless she'd actually experienced it. Sarah was still kneeling in front of Maya when Detective Michelle Ramirez appeared at her elbow. Michelle looked exactly how Sarah felt, like someone who'd been thrown into ice water and was trying to figure out how to breathe. Her off-duty status suddenly felt as irrelevant as Sarah's retirement. "We need to get her to an interview room," Michelle said quietly. "We need a trained forensic interviewer, someone who specializes in child testimony. We need to record everything she says, Document the exact language she uses. Preserve this moment exactly as it is." Sarah nodded, but she didn't move. She was still watching Maya's hand on Duke's fur, still processing the way the girl had come back to language through the simple act of touching a dog. There was something profoundly important in that moment that existed beyond evidence and testimony. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. Michelle understood what she was asking. How long had Maya been with Derek Hollins? How long had that small body been confined to darkness? How long had those ears been forced to listen to whatever horrors occurred in that place? "We don't know yet," Michelle said. "The parents reported her missing on a Thursday. She was found on the following Wednesday. That's 9 days unaccounted for." 9 days. Sarah did the math in her head and felt something cold crystallize in her chest. 9 days was enough time to do almost anything. 9 days was a lifetime when you were 3 years old. "What did he tell you when you arrested him?" Sarah asked, still not looking at Michelle, still watching Maya with an intensity that went beyond professional observation. "Nothing useful," Michelle admitted. "He lawyered up immediately. His attorney is some hotshot from the city, one of those guys who specializes in getting dangerous people back on the street through procedural technicalities. Hollins didn't confirm or deny anything, didn't answer questions, just sat there with this expression on his face like he knew something we didn't." Sarah understood that look. She'd seen it before, in the faces of predators who believed they'd outmaneuvered the system. The expression of someone who was 3 steps ahead, who had already thought through every possible outcome, and was confident that their intelligence and planning would protect them. That confidence, Sarah knew, could be a weapon, but it could also be a liability. "Where's the interview room?" Sarah asked, finally standing up. Michelle had already made the calls. Within minutes, they were moving. Sarah, Michelle, Maya, Duke, and the growing entourage of officers and forensic specialists who understood that they were racing against a legal clock. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to the moment when Hollins' attorney would file a motion to suppress, when a judge might decide that the evidence was contaminated or inadmissible or too circumstantial to warrant continued detention. The police department's interview room was small and deliberately designed to feel safe. Soft colors, no harsh lighting, a table with child-sized furniture, a camera mounted in the corner that was visible but not threatening. Sarah had been in this room 100 times over her career, watching other officers interview victims and witnesses. Now she was standing on the other side of the glass, watching a 3-year-old girl sit at a table and try to articulate trauma in the limited vocabulary of early childhood. The forensic interviewer was a woman named Dr. Linda Vasquez, a specialist who trained in child psychology and had spent 15 years conducting interviews with young victims. She was gentle with Maya, never pushing, never suggesting, simply asking open-ended questions that allowed the girl to direct the narrative. "Can you tell me about Derek?" Dr. Vasquez asked, her voice careful and slow. Maya's eyes had shifted. Now that she was in this new space, away from the party and away from Duke's comforting presence, the girl's voice had become smaller again, more fragile. But it hadn't stopped. The dam had broken. The language was still flowing. "Derek the man," Maya repeated, using the same phrasing she'd used at the party. "Derek take me. Derek say he take me to park, but we go to basement, dark basement, so dark I can't see." Dr. Vasquez remained still, her body language open and receptive. What did Derek do in the dark basement? Maya's hand came up to her mouth. Her thumb found its way between her teeth, a regression into infantile behavior, a visible sign of trauma and anxiety. But her eyes remained fixed on Dr. Vasquez's face. "Derek say I be quiet," Maya whispered. "Derek say if I make sound, he make hurt. He say police can't find dark basement. Police only find light things. Police need to see." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. She wasn't hearing the exact words Hollins would have used. A 3-year-old couldn't possibly remember dialogue with that kind of precision. Instead, she was hearing Maya's interpretation of what she'd been told, the way a child's mind had processed and stored information under conditions of extreme stress. But the meaning was clear. Hollins believed he was safe in that basement because darkness made him invisible. Darkness made him unknowable. Darkness was his sanctuary. "Did anything hurt you?" Dr. Vasquez asked softly. Maya's thumb came out of her mouth. Her entire body seemed to collapse slightly, becoming even smaller than it already was. And then, in a voice so quiet that Sarah had to strain to hear it even through the recording equipment, the girl said, Derek touch where mommy say private. Derek say it be our secret. Derek say if I tell he put me in darker dark where I can't breathe." Behind the glass, Sarah heard Michelle gasp. She heard someone whisper, "We need a medical examination immediately." She heard the machinery of the criminal justice system grinding into motion, accelerating now, no longer interested in technicalities or legal maneuvering, but focused entirely on one thing: documenting the crime that a 3-year-old had just described. But Sarah wasn't looking at the officers around her. She was looking at the girl in the interview room, at the way Maya's entire body had gone rigid, at the way speaking about what had happened was forcing her to relive it in real time. She thought about Derek Hollins, sitting in his house on Maple Street, probably drinking coffee or watching television, completely unaware that the foundation of his carefully constructed life was about to collapse. She thought about the word secret and how predators weaponized it, how they used it to isolate children, to make them complicit in their own abuse. She thought about the basement, that dark place where Hollins had hidden Maya, where he'd believed no one could find him, where he'd been wrong. And then Dr. Vasquez asked the question that would change everything. "Maya, you said Derek put you in a dark basement. Did you see other dark things in the basement, other things that Derek keep hidden?" Maya's hand came back up to her mouth. Her eyes, which had been fixed on Dr. Vasquez, suddenly shifted sideways. She was looking toward the corner of the room, toward the darkness where the shadows pooled in the space where the light from the lamp didn't quite reach. "Boxes," Maya whispered. "Dark boxes on the floor. Derek say the boxes sleep. Derek say the boxes is quiet now. Derek say the boxes can't hurt nobody." In the observation room, Detective Michelle Ramirez made a sound that might have been a gasp, or might have been a prayer, or might have been the sound of a career prosecutor, realizing that they were about to open a door that could never be closed again. "We need search teams," someone said. "We need to get back into that house with everything we've got." But Sarah was still watching Maya through the glass, still watching the way the girl's tiny body trembled as she tried to describe something her mind couldn't fully process, something too large and terrible for a 3-year-old vocabulary to contain. The boxes that sleep. The boxes that can't hurt anybody. The hidden things in the basement that a predator had kept like souvenirs, like proof, like a collection of evidence against himself that he'd somehow convinced himself would never be discovered. And Sarah understood in that moment that Derek Hollins had made one catastrophic mistake. He'd underestimated the intelligence of a child, the resilience of a voice that had learned to speak again, and the determination of a woman who dedicated her entire life to making sure that monsters couldn't hide in the dark anymore. The search warrant came through at 4:47 p.m., signed by Judge Patricia Mendez, a woman who'd presided over enough criminal cases to recognize the difference between probable cause and desperate hope. This was probable cause. A child's testimony, detailed and consistent, describing a specific location with specific evidence. It was enough. By 5:15 p.m., Sarah was sitting in the unmarked sedan parked 2 houses down from 412 Maple Street, Duke beside her, both of them watching the controlled chaos unfold with the practiced calm of veterans who'd done this before. The Hollins house was nothing remarkable, a single-story ranch with white siding and black shutters, a two-car garage, and a small front porch where a ceramic frog held a welcome sign that now seemed obscene in its irony. The tactical team had arrived first, establishing a perimeter, confirming that Derek Hollins was not currently on the property. His car was gone, registered to a 2019 Honda Civic, silver, plate number visible on every traffic camera within a 15-mile radius. They were already looking for it, already broadcasting his description, already beginning the machinery of pursuit. But the house was what mattered now. Michelle appeared at Sarah's window, her face flushed with the kind of adrenaline that came from crossing from investigation into action. She was still in her casual clothes, jeans and a police academy t-shirt, but her badge was clipped to her belt, and her eyes had that sharp, predatory focus that Sarah recognized from 2 decades of working alongside her. "We're going in," Michelle said. "Forensics is standing by. They want you and Duke inside once we've established it's clear. Your dog's detection work could be critical. If there are human remains, we need to map exactly where they are before we start moving anything." Sarah nodded. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment when a 3-year-old's fragmentary words became concrete, undeniable evidence. The moment when boxes that sleep became something real. She clipped Duke's lead to his collar, making sure the dog understood they were transitioning from civilian mode back into operational status. Duke's entire demeanor shifted. His ears came up. His focus sharpened. 8 years of training responded to the implicit signal that work was beginning again. The interior of the Hollins house smelled like coffee and stale air, and the particular must of a home whose owner had been absent for several hours. The tactical team had cleared it room by room, living room, kitchen, bedrooms, bathrooms, all empty, all ordinary, all heartbreakingly normal. A television sat in the living room with the remote on the armrest, suggesting Hollins had left in a hurry, abandoning his life mid-leisure. But it was the utility room where everything changed. Sarah saw it the moment she entered, a section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest, a rectangular seam running vertically, the kind of detail that would be invisible to a casual observer but was glaring to anyone who knew how to look for it. The false wall had been constructed carefully, professionally. Whoever had built it understood construction, understood load-bearing walls, understood how to create a hidden space without compromising the structural integrity of the house. Derek Hollins understood construction. Derek Hollins was a carpenter. The forensics team had already begun the process of dismantling the wall, using careful precision rather than brute force. They removed panels one by one, photographing each step, documenting the process for the inevitable court proceedings. And as they worked, the opening slowly became larger. Beyond it lay darkness. Sarah could see the outline of a door frame, wooden and new, with a lock mechanism that looked professionally installed. She could see the top edge of what appeared to be concrete steps descending into blackness. She could feel the temperature shift, could sense the difference between the warm, lived-in air of the house above and the cold, stagnant air that emanated from below. This was where he'd kept her. This was where Maya had spent 9 days. "Ready?" Michelle asked, positioning herself at the top of the staircase. Sarah didn't answer with words. Instead, she unclipped Duke's lead, letting the dog work free. This was what he'd been trained for. This was the work that mattered, the work that transcended retirement and politics and the machinery of law enforcement to touch something primal and necessary. Duke descended first, his powerful body moving down the concrete steps with careful deliberation. Sarah followed, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the basement in geometric slices. Behind her came Michelle, and behind Michelle came the forensic team, all of them moving with the understanding that they were walking into a crime scene that would define their careers, would haunt their nightmares, would become the case they referenced for the rest of their lives. The basement was larger than the house above it suggested, excavated deeper, extended further back. the kind of space that would require serious work, serious planning, serious intention to construct. The walls were concrete, unpainted, utilitarian. Industrial lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, though they were currently dark. The air was cold and held a smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. Not the smell of death, not yet, but the smell of human habitation in a space designed for anything but living. Duke moved to the far corner and sat. The alert was immediate, unmistakable. Not the subtle indication of a possible detection, but the sharp, definitive alert that meant the dog had identified exactly what he'd been trained to find. Human remains. Multiple locations based on the way Duke's body language shifted, the way he looked back at Sarah with something that might have been sorrow in his ancient, intelligent eyes. The forensics team moved with practiced efficiency, sweeping the basement with alternate light sources, marking areas with numbered placards, photographing everything before touching anything. And as the light sources moved across the concrete floor, Sarah began to see what Duke had smelled from the moment he entered the space. Boxes. Not cardboard boxes. Storage containers, the kind people used to organize their lives, their memories, their treasures. Except these boxes contained something else entirely. In one, visible through the partially open lid, Sarah could see what appeared to be clothing. Children's clothing. Small enough for a 5-year-old, small enough for a 6-year-old, small enough for children who were no longer small, who were no longer anywhere. In another box, carefully arranged and organized, lay items that made Sarah's breath catch. Hair clips, stuffed animals with the fabric worn thin from handling, shoes that had belonged to feet that had stopped growing decades ago. "Oh God," Michelle whispered, and Sarah heard the sound of someone breaking, someone finally feeling the full weight of what they were witnessing. But it wasn't the boxes of belongings that marked the true horror of the space. It was what lay beneath the concrete in certain corners of the basement, subtle depressions in the floor, areas where the concrete had been laid more recently, where the color and texture were slightly different from the rest. Areas where something had been buried. "Get ground-penetrating radar," Sarah heard someone say, their voice professional and distant, the voice of someone compartmentalizing horror into procedural steps. "We need to know what's under that concrete." Duke remained sitting in the corner, his alert complete, his job done. But the dog didn't leave. Instead, he sat vigil, as if his presence was necessary to bear witness to what had been hidden here, what had been perpetrated in this cold, dark space beneath a house that looked like anyone's house, where anyone's neighbors had walked past without knowing what was occurring beneath their feet. Sarah found herself kneeling beside Duke, her hand on his warm fur, needing the connection, needing the reality of a living, breathing being in a space that had become a tomb. Around them, the forensic team continued their work, documenting, measuring, photographing, creating a record that would eventually be presented to a jury, that would make people understand exactly what kind of monster Derek Hollins was. 3 bodies so far, she heard Michelle say into her phone, her voice steady now, professional, the kind of voice that spoke death statistics like they were weather reports. Possibly 4 based on the burial markers. We're bringing in specialized equipment. This is going to take hours, possibly days. Sarah closed her eyes and felt Duke's head turn toward her, the dog's muzzle resting against her leg in a gesture that was somehow both comforting and utterly devastating. They had found the boxes that sleep, and the implications of what lay beneath this concrete were far darker, far more numerous, far more monstrous than anyone had dared to imagine when Maya had whispered those words just hours before. The silver Honda Civic was spotted at 6:52 p.m. on Highway 15, heading north toward the state line. A traffic camera had caught the plate number as it passed through a toll booth, and within minutes, every law enforcement agency within 3 counties had the description, the direction of travel, and the understanding that they were looking for a man who just realized his world had collapsed. Sarah watched the dispatch updates come through in real time on her laptop, still sitting in the basement of the Hollins house, while forensics continued their macabre work around her. Duke lay at her feet, the dog's energy finally depleted, the adrenaline of detection work giving way to the exhaustion of having witnessed something profoundly wrong. Ground-penetrating radar had been deployed at 5:30 p.m. The results had come back at 5:47 p.m. 4 separate burial sites beneath the concrete. 4 distinct signals indicating human remains. The forensics team was now working to carefully expose each site, to collect evidence that would eventually allow for identification, for the notification of families, for the closing of missing persons cases that had gone cold years ago. 4 confirmed dead, possibly more. "He's heading toward the mountains," Michelle said, appearing in the basement doorway with a printed map already marked with highway routes and geographic bottlenecks. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice hoarse from talking on the phone for the past 2 hours. "We've got state police setting up checkpoints at every pass. We've got roadblocks at the border. He's not getting out of the state. He's not getting away." But Sarah had spent 23 years understanding how criminals thought, and she wasn't convinced. "He's not running for the border," Sarah said quietly, tracing Duke's silken ear with her finger. "He's running for visibility. He's running toward the one place where he knows he can blend into a crowd." Michelle stopped walking, turned. "What do you mean?" "A predator like this doesn't panic," Sarah explained, her voice the careful tone of someone who'd studied monsters so carefully that she could think like them without becoming them. "He plans. He anticipates. The highway toward the border is exactly where we'd expect him to go, which means it's exactly where he doesn't want to be. He's going to double back. He's going to move toward the city, toward Denver probably, toward a place with 10 million people where one person can disappear into the noise." Michelle's jaw clenched. She was already pulling out her phone, already calling the FBI field office, already redirecting resources based on Sarah's profile. But even as she did, Sarah knew the truth that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. If Derek Hollins made it to Denver, if he made it into the urban maze before they found him, finding him would be exponentially harder. And if he found another child before they found him. Sarah didn't finish that thought. Back at the police station, the FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Patricia Kovac had been brought in at 4:15 p.m., immediately after the basement had been discovered. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen too many crime scene photos, read too many case files, understood too deeply the mechanics of human depravity. She'd spent the last 3 hours in a conference room with every available detective, constructing a profile of who Derek Hollins was, predicting where he'd go, anticipating what he'd do. "He's a control-oriented, organized offender," Dr. Kovac had explained to the assembled team, her voice clinical and precise. "He doesn't act on impulse. The basement was his sanctuary, his kingdom. Now that it's been violated, he's experiencing what we call a reality crash, the moment when the fantasy he's constructed collides with the actual world and shatters. In this moment, he's extraordinarily dangerous because he has nothing left to lose." "How long do we have?" Sarah had asked via video conference from the basement. "Hours possibly," Dr. Kovac had replied. "He'll be experiencing intense emotional dysregulation. The fantasy is destroyed. The basement is discovered. He's lost his sanctuary, his collection, his entire constructed world. The statistical likelihood is that he'll either attempt suicide, which is common, or he'll attempt to recreate what he had by taking another child." "How long before the second option becomes active?" "Immediately," Dr. Kovac had said. "Within hours. He'll need to reestablish control to prove that he's still powerful, still capable. A child represents that power. A child is the evidence that he's still functional, still intelligent, still able to execute his plan." That conversation had happened 4 hours ago. The sun was now setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed obscene given what was occurring beneath it. A child predator was loose in the state, experiencing psychological collapse, and the clock was running down toward whatever terrible thing he decided to do next. "We've widened the search," Michelle said, returning to the basement with a tactical map. "We've got unmarked units positioned on every highway that leads into Denver. We've got surveillance on bus stations, airports, train depots. We've got his photo being distributed to every hotel and motel clerk within 200 miles. He can't move without being seen." But Sarah was thinking about what Dr. Kovac had said, about the reality crash, about the psychological state of someone whose entire constructed world had been demolished in the span of a few hours by a 3-year-old girl and a police dog. "He won't use public transportation," Sarah said. "He'll carjack. He'll force someone to take him. He'll take hostages because he understands that hostages buy time, that they complicate police response, that they give him leverage." "Jesus," Michelle whispered. "And he'll target somewhere specific," Sarah continued, her mind moving through the logic of a predatory mind the way she'd learned to do over decades of case studies and interrogations. "Not random, specific, somewhere that has meaning for him, somewhere he's planned before, somewhere he feels safe." "Do we know where that would be?" Michelle asked. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about everything they knew about Derek Hollins. Carpenter, organized, meticulous, building contractor who specialized in basement renovations, a man who understood space, who understood how to create hidden rooms, who understood the geography of concealment. "He'll go somewhere with children," Sarah said quietly. "A school, a daycare, a park. Somewhere he can observe, can plan, can begin the selection process for the next victim. He's going to rebuild. He's going to try to recapture what he's lost." Behind her, Duke suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears came forward. His body tensed in the way that indicated he was sensing something, detecting something on a frequency that human senses couldn't process. Sarah had learned to trust that instinct implicitly. Duke wasn't reacting to anything in the basement. He was reacting to something psychic, something emotional, something that existed in the space between intention and action. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Her hands went cold as she opened it. The message contained a single image, a screenshot of a news article about the Hollins investigation, and beneath it, a caption in all capitals. "You took MY World, now I'm taking yours." Sarah's blood ran to ice. She showed the phone to Michelle without speaking. Michelle's face went pale. "Where did it come from?" "A burner phone," Sarah said, already checking the metadata, already seeing the implications. "He knows we were looking for him. He knows we found the basement. He's not running randomly. He's communicating. He's sending a message." "A threat," Michelle breathed. "A promise," Sarah corrected. And in that moment, she understood something that made her entire body go rigid with a terrible, perfect clarity. Derek Hollins wasn't running to escape. He was running toward something. He was running toward a target, toward a victim, toward a resolution that he'd already decided upon. And the message was for Sarah specifically, because he knew she was the one who'd orchestrated his downfall. "He's coming for me," Sarah said quietly. But even as she said the words, she realized they were only partially true. He wasn't coming for Sarah. He was coming for something far more precious, far more vulnerable, something that would hurt far deeper than any physical wound. He was coming for the one thing that had brought him down in the first place. A small girl named Maya Reeves, who'd found her voice in the presence of a police dog and dared to speak the truth that a predator had spent years trying to silence. Jessica Carlisle's story was perfect. Too perfect. Sarah should have realized it the moment the young woman appeared on her front porch at 11:47 p.m., rain-soaked and shaking, with terror carved into every feature of her face. But in that moment, filled with the adrenaline of the discovery and the weight of the threat message, Sarah had operated from instinct rather than logic. She'd pulled Jessica inside. She'd offered blankets and water and the kind of safety that only a police officer's home could provide. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., sitting at her kitchen table with Jessica's detailed account of her captivity, that the inconsistencies began to surface. "He kept me in a room on the east side of the basement," Jessica had explained, her voice trembling in a way that seemed authentic, that seemed like genuine trauma. "There were 2 other women, I think. I could hear them sometimes crying, but he kept them separate. He said that if we couldn't see each other, we couldn't organize, couldn't plan an escape together." Sarah had listened, had taken notes, had nodded at the right moments. But her mind had been racing backward, reviewing everything they knew about the basement layout, about the space Derek Hollins had constructed. The basement had no east side that would accommodate a separate room. The entire structure was divided into 4 burial sites and a central storage area. There was no space for living quarters. There was no logical place where someone could be kept alive for extended periods without being visible to forensics equipment. "Tell me about when he released you," Sarah had asked carefully, watching Jessica's face for tells, for the micro-expressions that would indicate deception. "He said," Jessica had paused, her hand shaking as she lifted her water glass. "He said something about needing to disappear. He showed me the news articles on a laptop about what happened in Colorado, about the police finding his other house. He said he was famous now, that he needed to vanish again. But then he said something that made no sense. He said, except I can't, not without her." Sarah's instincts had screamed at her. Not without her. He'd let Jessica go for a reason. He'd orchestrated her arrival at Sarah's house for a purpose. And the purpose became clear when Jessica had continued her story with a precision that sounded rehearsed, that sounded like it had been constructed and refined in a mind that understood how to manipulate police procedure. "He said he had a plan for Maya," Jessica had whispered. "He said he knew where she lived now, that all the news coverage had given away too much information. He has her address. He's been watching her." And that was when Sarah understood. That was when the trap became visible. Derek Hollins hadn't released Jessica out of mercy or oversight. He'd released her as bait. He'd sent her to Sarah specifically. Sarah, the retired officer whose name had been splashed across the news, whose face had appeared in every article about the investigation, whose address wasn't secret to anyone with an internet connection and basic research skills. Jessica wasn't a victim seeking help. She was a messenger. She was the mechanism by which Derek Hollins had delivered his threat directly to Sarah's attention. But Sarah had already made the call to Michelle. She'd already set in motion the response that Hollins would have anticipated. And worse, she'd done it in front of Jessica, who was now watching her with an expression that had subtly shifted from terror to something else, something colder. "I need to ask you something," Sarah had said quietly, her hand moving to the .38 on her hip. "How long have you been working with him?" Jessica's response had been to smile. Not a warm smile, but the kind of smile that came from a face that had been trained to perform emotion rather than feel it. The smile of someone who'd been broken so thoroughly that she'd been reconstructed as a tool, as an implement of someone else's will. "Long enough," Jessica had replied. "He said if I did this, he'd let me keep my fingernails. He said if I helped him get what he needed, he'd stop the hurt." Sarah had felt something die inside her at those words. Jessica Carlisle was a victim, yes, but she was also something else now. A casualty of psychological warfare, a person so damaged by captivity and abuse that her perpetrator had managed to weaponize her own trauma against other potential victims. "He's not coming for you," Sarah had said, her voice steady despite the horror crashing through her. "Is he?" "No," Jessica had confirmed, her smile fatting into something more like resignation. "He's coming for the girl. He said he'd been watching her house. He said he knew the schedule of her parents, the location of her bedroom, the best time to take her again. He said that if he had her back, if everyone saw him with a child who loved him, who wasn't damaged or scarred, then no jury would believe the other accusations. He said children are the best defense." Sarah's hands had gone cold. She'd already picked up the phone to call Michelle again, to redirect resources to Maya's house, to organize protection, to mobilize every available officer. But even as she dialed, she'd understood the terrible logic of what Hollins had done. He'd created a distraction. He'd sent Jessica to Sarah. He'd ensured that law enforcement would spend crucial minutes processing information that was partially true but fundamentally designed to misdirect. While every unit in the county was positioning themselves to stop a threat that might come from one direction, the actual threat was already moving toward a completely different target. He said, Jessica had continued, her voice barely audible now. He said he'd been planning to take her since she was found. He said a child who'd already been traumatized once would be easier the second time. He said trauma victims are predictable. He said fear creates obedience. Sarah had hung up on Michelle mid-sentence and started running toward her car, Duke already moving, already understanding that something had shifted, that the safe space of Sarah's home had transformed into the staging ground for something catastrophic. He let me go, Jessica had called after her as Sarah had grabbed her keys and her weapon. He said if I warned you too late, you'd understand how smart he is. He said he was always 3 steps ahead. As Sarah had driven through the rain-soaked streets toward Maya's house, her mind had constructed the timeline with a horrible clarity. Jessica had arrived at her house at 11:47 p.m. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours. It was now almost 2:00 a.m. Hollins had likely already been in position. Hollins had probably been watching Maya's house while Jessica was sitting in Sarah's kitchen, spinning her story of captivity and survival. Hollins had had hours to plan, to wait, to position himself perfectly for the moment when he could slip inside and take back what he believed belonged to him. And Sarah was driving as fast as she could toward a destination where she might already be too late. Duke's head was out the window, his ears streaming behind him in the wind. The dog's body language had shifted into something primal and urgent, something that suggested he understood they were moving toward danger, toward a child in peril, toward a moment that would define everything that came after. "Hold on, Maya," Sarah had whispered as the car cut through the darkness. "Hold on, I'm coming. Duke's coming, we're coming." But even as she'd said the words, Sarah had known the terrible truth. Derek Hollins had played her perfectly. He'd used her own instincts against her, her own desire to protect victims, her own belief that she could prevent tragedy. And by the time Sarah understood the trap, by the time the pieces had finally clicked into place, it might already be too late to stop him from doing exactly what he'd promised to do. Sarah's hands were steady as she raised her weapon, but her mind was screaming. Through the darkness of the hallway, she could see the outline of Derek Hollins standing over Maya's bed, could see the cloth in his hand, probably chloroform or some other sedative, could see the casual confidence in his posture that suggested he'd already won this moment before Sarah had even arrived. The terrible part was that he probably had. "Officer Sarah Chen," Hollins said, his voice carrying the kind of measured calm that came from a mind that had rehearsed this scenario 100 times. "The legendary K-9 handler, the woman who never retired early before today, the woman who broke her own rules the moment a 3-year-old girl looked at her dog." Sarah didn't respond. Her training screamed at her not to engage, not to give him the satisfaction of conversation, not to let him establish the narrative of this moment. But she needed information. She needed to understand what he'd already done, what other pieces were moving in the darkness around her. "Step away from the bed," Sarah commanded, her weapon held at center mass, her training and experience compressed into those 5 words. Hollins didn't step away. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for Sarah to see his face in the faint light coming through the window. He was younger than his photos suggested, probably mid-30s, with features that could have been handsome if they weren't animated by something fundamentally broken, fundamentally wrong. His eyes held the kind of intelligence that was worse than mere cruelty. This was the intelligence of someone who understood human psychology, who grasped the mechanics of control, who knew exactly how to manipulate systems and people to achieve his objectives. "Or what?" Hollins asked, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah's blood run colder than the October night. "You'll shoot me. You'll kill me right here in this little girl's bedroom and traumatize her all over again. Or you'll wound me and I'll fight and we'll struggle, and during that struggle something might happen to the child. You've already lost, Officer Chen. I'm not here to take Maya. I'm here because I knew you would come. I knew you wouldn't be able to stay away. And I knew that when you got here, you'd face a choice." Sarah's jaw clenched. Every instinct told her to fire, to end this now, to eliminate the threat before it could manifest. But Hollins was right about one thing. She was in a position where every action had consequences that extended beyond herself. In this confined space, with a sleeping child meters away, with the walls close enough to contain Ricochet, there were no clean solutions. "What choice?" Sarah asked, her voice steady even as her mind raced through tactical scenarios. "The one all cops eventually face," Hollins said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The choice between following the rules or saving the person you love." And then Sarah heard it, the soft snick of a door lock engaging, the creak of another door opening, a door she hadn't registered, a room she hadn't cleared because her focus had been entirely on Hollins and Maya. Behind her, down in the darkness of the hallway, Sarah heard the soft breathing of another human being. And then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, she understood what Hollins had done. He'd anticipated her arrival. He'd anticipated her tactical approach. He'd anticipated everything except the one thing that would actually work. He'd positioned an accomplice in the space behind her. "I have another friend upstairs," Hollins confirmed, and there was something almost gleeful in his voice now, the sound of someone who'd executed a plan with precision and was savoring the moment of revelation. "Jessica told me everything, Officer Chen. How kind of her to stop by your house. How kind of her to let me know exactly where to find you. She's been working with me since she made it to your front door. Right now, she's in the room behind you with her hand on your retired partner's head. She has a gun. She has instructions to shoot him if you make any move I don't approve of." Sarah didn't turn around. Every part of her training screamed not to break visual contact with the primary threat. But she could feel the presence now, could sense the gun barrel aimed at Duke's skull, could understand with a terrible, perfect clarity that Hollins had weaponized her greatest vulnerability. Her dog, her partner, the living being who dedicated 8 years to trusting her judgment, to following her leads, to working beside her without question or doubt. "So here's your choice," Hollins continued, lowering his hand away from Maya's small body. The cloth disappeared into his pocket. He spread his hands in a gesture that was almost mockingly peaceful. "You shoot me, I die. Maybe you even make it look clean, even write a report that justifies lethal force in defense of a child. But Jessica shoots your dog, the dog that broke this entire case open, the dog that trusted you to keep him safe. The dog that will die in this hallway, because you decided that justice was more important than loyalty." He paused, letting the silence stretch like a hunting trap. "Or," he continued softly, "you lower your weapon, you let me walk out of here. You let me disappear into the system, into the network of people like me who know how to hide, how to move, how to become invisible. And I promise you on everything I am, I will never hurt another child. I'll go far away. I'll disappear. I'll become a ghost, Officer Chen. All you have to do is lower your weapon and your dog lives. Your dog gets to go home with you. Your dog gets to live out whatever years he has left in peace and comfort, instead of bleeding out on a child's bedroom floor." Sarah's hands were shaking now. Behind her, the presence of Jessica was becoming clearer, more real. A gun aimed at Duke's head. A gun held by someone Sarah had foolishly trusted, someone she'd offered safety and comfort to, someone who'd used Sarah's compassion as a tool for her own survival. The math was simple. Hollins was already identified, already photographed, already broadcast to law enforcement across the country. Even if he escaped tonight, even if he disappeared, there was a possibility, however remote, that he might be caught eventually. But Duke was here. Duke was real. Duke was irreplaceable in a way that no criminal justice outcome could measure. Sarah's arm lowered slightly. Just an inch. Just enough to indicate that she was considering Holland's offer, that she was truly facing the impossible choice that separated heroes from villains, that she was about to surrender her principles to save the one being who'd never asked her for anything but loyalty. Holland smiled. "Good," he whispered. "Good, Officer Chen. You're smarter than I thought. You understand what matters. You understand that." He never finished the sentence. Duke didn't wait for a command. 8 years of tactical training, 8 years of understanding the difference between obedience and survival, 8 years of reading Sarah's body language and her intentions even when they were unspoken. All of that merged into a single moment of perfect, terrible decision-making. The dog bolted. Jessica's scream came a fraction of a second later, a sound of surprise and pain as Duke's 70-pound frame drove her backward, with a force that her untrained body couldn't absorb. The gun fired once wildly, the bullet passing through empty air where Duke's body had been milliseconds before. Sarah pivoted and fired once, not at Jessica but at the gun itself. The weapon flew backward and Jessica screamed again, her hand exploding with pain and blood. Holland lunged forward, moving with the speed and desperation of someone who understood that his moment had passed, that his careful plan had been destroyed by something he hadn't accounted for. A dog who loved his handler more than he loved his own life. Sarah spun back toward him, her weapon already raised. The next seconds existed in the space between heartbeats, in the gap between intention and consequence, in that terrible moment where violence becomes the only language that still makes sense. And in that moment, Sarah Chen made a choice. But it wasn't the choice anyone expected. It wasn't the choice that logic suggested. It was the choice that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that understood that sometimes saving yourself means letting someone else decide what they're willing to die for. Duke hit Derek Holland from the side with the force of a 200-pound guided missile, driving him against the bedroom wall with a sound like thunder. The air exploded from Holland's lungs. His body crumpled under the impact, but he didn't go down completely. Years of construction work had built muscle memory, had taught his body how to absorb impact and keep functioning. He fought. Sarah had seen dog attacks before. She trained dog attacks, had studied them from both the canine and human perspective. But she'd never witnessed one conducted with the kind of precision that Duke executed in that moment. The dog didn't bite. His training had been explicit on that point: non-lethal immobilization, control without permanent injury. Instead, Duke used his body as a battering ram, his weight as a weapon, his sheer physical presence as a tool for pinning and controlling. Holland struggled anyway, driven by adrenaline and desperation, and the primal understanding that his moment was ending. His fists came up, trying to push the dog away, trying to create distance. But distance was the one thing Sarah wouldn't allow. She moved forward, her weapon raised, her training compressing into a single moment of absolute clarity. She didn't shout a warning. She didn't give Holland a final chance to surrender. Instead, she brought the butt of her pistol down in a controlled arc aimed at the junction of neck and shoulder, the pressure point that would incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Holland went limp. Duke held his position for another 3 seconds, his breathing heavy, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and exertion. Sarah kept her weapon trained on Holland's unconscious form, waiting for the moment when tactical precision gave way to actual arrest, when violence transformed into procedure. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. Good boy, hold." Duke held. The sirens arrived 6 minutes later, their wailing cutting through the night air like something primal and necessary. Sarah kept her weapon trained on Holland's body, kept her eyes on the doorway, kept her awareness focused on the space where Jessica was still crying, still clutching her bleeding hand, still processing the fact that her attempt to help the man who destroyed her had ended in failure. The tactical team came in dark, as instructed, their precision movements clearing the bedroom and securing the scene. They took Jessica first, carefully, professionally, understanding that she was both victim and witness, both perpetrator and pawn. They took Hollins next, zip-tying his wrists, checking him for additional weapons, reading him his rights with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from having done this 1,000 times before. And then they turned their attention to Sarah. She was still standing over Maya's bed, her weapon lowered but not holstered, her body operating on the fumes of adrenaline that were beginning to drain away and leave something like shock in their wake. Duke remained at her side, his massive body pressed against her leg, the dog's breathing beginning to return to normal, his alert state finally acknowledging that the threat had passed. Officer Chen, a young tactical officer, approached carefully, his hands visible and empty. "I need you to lower your weapon and step back from the child." Sarah did as instructed, her training overriding the tremor in her hands. The weapon went into her holster with the muscle memory of 2 decades. She stepped back from Maya's bed, and that was when she finally allowed herself to look at the small girl who'd started all of this. Maya was awake. Her eyes were wide with the kind of trauma that no 3-year-old should ever have to process. She was clutching a stuffed animal, a worn bear with matted fur, and she was staring at Derek Hollins as the tactical team hauled him out of the bedroom. "Police dog," Maya whispered, her voice finding words again in the presence of security. "Police dog, save me again." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She knelt beside the small girl, her hands shaking, and pulled Maya into an embrace that was probably more for Sarah's benefit than the child's. But Maya accepted it, her tiny arms coming up around Sarah's neck, her small body shaking with the aftermath of having nearly been taken again by the monster she'd already survived once. Michelle arrived at 2:47 a.m., her face flushed from driving too fast through the darkness. She took in the scene, the tactical team securing the bedroom, the paramedics working on Jessica's hand, the unconscious form of Derek Hollins being loaded into a police transport vehicle, and simply shook her head. "You called it," Michelle said quietly, standing beside Sarah. "You said he'd come for Maya. You were 3 steps ahead of him." "No," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse. "Duke was 3 steps ahead of him. I was just finally catching up." The dog made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, his amber eyes tracking between Sarah and Maya, understanding on some fundamental level that both humans in his care had been in danger, and that he'd been the factor that had shifted the outcome. The paramedics wanted to take Maya to the hospital for evaluation. Her parents arrived at 3:15 a.m., having been notified by Child Services, and the reunion was the kind of thing that broke something open in everyone who witnessed it. A mother's scream, a father's tears, a small girl who'd survived the unsurvivable, being held by the people who loved her most in the safety of her own home. But there were still questions. There were still protocols. There was still the machinery of criminal justice that had to grind forward, had to process, had to take the events of this night and transform them into evidence and testimony and the building blocks of a trial. Sarah gave her statement at 4:30 a.m., sitting in the living room of Maya's house with Michelle and an internal affairs detective named Robert Torres. She was careful with her language. She was precise about the threat assessment. She was accurate about the moment when Duke had moved, when Duke had decided that loyalty was more important than obedience, when her dog had made a choice that had saved 3 lives, Maya's, Sarah's, and Jessica's, who might have been killed by Hollins if the situation had escalated further. "Your use of force against the suspect was justified," Torres confirmed, reviewing his notes. "The suspect initiated physical confrontation. You responded with appropriate restraint. The shot directed at Jessica Carlisle's weapon rather than at the suspect or the accomplice demonstrates excellent tactical judgment under extreme stress. This will be categorized as a clean shooting. Sarah nodded, but the words felt hollow. There was nothing clean about any of this. There was nothing clean about a 3-year-old being traumatized twice. There was nothing clean about Jessica Carlisle being so thoroughly broken by captivity that she'd been willing to participate in kidnapping another child to protect herself. There was nothing clean about Derek Hollins having somehow convinced himself that he could recreate his world by taking back the one person who destroyed it. By 6:30 a.m., when the sun began to break over the horizon, Sarah was sitting on the front porch of Maya's house with Duke at her side. The dog's breathing had returned to normal. The tremor had left his body, but his eyes remained alert, tracking movements, remaining vigilant even though the immediate threat had passed. Michelle sat down beside her, handing her a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made an hour ago and left to get cold. "The DA is already building the case," Michelle said. "With the basement discovery, with Maya's testimony, with Jessica's statement about what Hollins told her, we have multiple corroborating accounts. We have physical evidence. We have a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. This case is airtight." "And Jessica?" Sarah asked quietly. "Victim Advocacy Services," Michelle replied. "Psychological evaluation. Possible prosecution for the events at your house, but the DA is inclined to offer immunity in exchange for her complete cooperation. She's a victim who was manipulated into participation, not a knowing accomplice." Sarah didn't respond. She was thinking about Jessica, about the way the young woman had smiled when she realized Sarah understood the trap, about the terrible logic of someone so damaged that they would betray another victim to protect themselves. "You did good work," Michelle said, and there was something almost paternal in her voice. "You broke this case. You saw through Hollins' manipulation. You made the right choices." But Sarah was thinking about the choice she'd almost made. The choice to lower her weapon, to surrender her principles, to let a predator walk free in exchange for her dog's safety. And she was thinking about Duke, who'd refused to let her make that choice, who'd forced the issue with an act of loyalty that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, between training and instinct. And as the sun rose over Maya's house, as the evidence teams began to pack up their equipment, as the machinery of criminal justice began its slow march toward trial and conviction, Sarah understood something profound. Sometimes the most important choices aren't the ones we make, but the ones we're saved from making by the loyalty of those who love us. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a courtroom gallery watching Derek Hollins enter through the side door, his orange jail uniform a stark contrast to the gray suit he'd worn when he'd constructed his basement paradise. His attorney, the same hotshot from the city who'd orchestrated his bail, was making arguments about procedural violations and contaminated evidence chains, but everyone in the courtroom could see the reality written on Hollins' face. He understood that he was finished. The preliminary hearing lasted 6 hours. Maya testified via closed-circuit television from a room downstairs, her small voice describing darkness and fear, and the relief of being found by a police dog. Jessica gave her statement, her hands still bandaged from the gunshot wound, her voice trembling but firm as she detailed the manipulation and coercion that had transformed her from victim into accomplice. The forensics team presented their findings. 4 confirmed bodies beneath the concrete of the basement, 3 of them identified as children missing for between 2 and 5 years. Physical evidence from each burial site, DNA matches, a chronology of predation that stretched back farther than anyone had initially suspected. By the time the judge ordered Hollins held without bail, the outcome was never in doubt. But Sarah wasn't really watching Hollins. She was watching the gallery behind the prosecution's table, where Maya sat with her parents, where the families of the other victims had come to bear witness, where the human cost of Derek Hollins' years of violence was made visible in the faces of people whose lives had been forever altered. Duke wasn't with her. State law prohibited dogs in the courtroom, even certified police dogs with decades of service records. Instead, he was at home, lying in his favorite spot by the living room window, watching for Sarah's return the way he'd been trained to wait, the way his entire life had been structured around the promise that his handler would always come back. That promise was about to change. Sarah had received the official letter from the police department 2 weeks after the night at Maya's house. Her retirement was being reinstated, effective immediately, with the understanding that her temporary reactivation for the critical investigation had been the exception rather than the rule. The pension was secure. The benefits would continue. She was, once again, officially retired from the force. But the letter that mattered more had come from the FBI. Special Agent Dr. Patricia Kovac had requested a meeting, and Sarah had sat across from her in a federal building conference room, listening to a proposal that had fundamentally altered her understanding of what her future could be. "We're forming a specialized unit," Dr. Kovac had explained, sliding a folder across the table. "K9 Assisted Victim Advocacy. We work with traumatized children, particularly those who have been victims of sexual abuse or abduction. What we learned from your work with Maya is that the presence of a certified police dog can facilitate communication in ways that traditional interview techniques cannot. Dogs seem to bypass the psychological barriers that trauma creates. They give children permission to speak." Sarah had read through the proposal carefully. It was well researched. It was legitimate. It was also a job offer. "Duke would need to be recertified," Sarah had said, thinking out loud. "We retired him. His trauma response detection isn't fresh." "We know," Dr. Kovac had replied. "That's the point. We don't want burned-out handlers forcing tired dogs to work. We want partners who are choosing to work together. Duke is 8 years old. He's in excellent health. And based on what happened at Maya's house, his instincts regarding trauma are sharper than we've ever seen in any dog at any agency." Sarah had asked for time to think about it. She'd spent a week sitting with the question, watching Duke move around her house, observing the way the dog seemed restless in retirement, seemed to be searching for something that Netflix and afternoon naps couldn't provide. Dogs, Sarah had learned over 8 years, were built for purpose. They were designed to work, to have direction, to understand their role in the larger ecosystem. Retirement for a dog wasn't freedom. It was a kind of slow fatting, a gradual dimming of the light that came from knowing you mattered, that your skills were needed, that your work had meaning. By the end of the week, Sarah had called Dr. Kovac back with her answer. Now, sitting in the courtroom as Derek Hollins was remanded to custody without possibility of bail, Sarah was thinking about transitions, about endings that became beginnings, about the ways that life didn't work the way you planned it, but sometimes worked better anyway. After the hearing concluded, Maya's mother approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. The woman looked hollow-eyed and traumatized in the way of people who'd had their worst fears realized. But there was also something steely about her, something that suggested she was building her life back from the rubble and finding purpose in the process. "Thank you," she said simply, and the words seemed inadequate for what they were trying to convey. "I know you did your job. I know the legal system did what it was supposed to do, but if you hadn't come that night, if you hadn't understood what Hollins was planning, Maya wouldn't be here. She would be gone." Sarah didn't have words that felt true. Instead, she said, "Duke saved her. I just got out of the way." "No," Maya's mother replied, and there was a fierceness in her voice that seemed to come from the deepest part of her. "You never got out of the way. You came back when you were supposed to stay retired. You came to my daughter's house in the middle of the night because something inside you knew that she needed help. That's not just doing a job. That's being a hero." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she wasn't a hero, that she'd almost made a catastrophic mistake, that it was only luck and Duke's loyalty that had saved anyone. But she was learning that sometimes people needed to believe in heroes, needed to have someone who'd incarnated their values and their hope, even if that incarnation was complicated and flawed and far less certain than it appeared. "How is she?" Sarah asked, genuinely wanting to know. "Better," Maya's mother said. "She's still having nightmares. We're working with a trauma therapist who specializes in childhood abuse. Some days are harder than others, but she talks about the police dog all the time. She wants one. We're thinking about getting her a service dog, someone she can bond with, someone who will help her feel safe again." Sarah found herself smiling at that. The idea of a small girl and a dog rebuilding trust together, learning that not all people were predators and not all spaces were dangerous, seemed like the truest kind of healing. That evening, Sarah sat on her front porch with Duke's head in her lap, watching the autumn sun descend toward the horizon. She'd made her decision about the FBI offer, and with that decision came an understanding of what her life was going to be. Not retirement, not in the way she'd imagined it. Instead, a new chapter, a different kind of work, a purpose that had emerged from tragedy and found its shape in the intersection of trauma and healing, of violence and recovery, of the particular magic that existed between a broken child and a loyal dog. "We're going back to work," Sarah whispered, stroking Duke's soft fur. "Not the old way, not the way we've been doing it, but we're going back." Duke's tail thumped against the porch boards, a sound like an answer, like agreement, like the dog had been waiting for this moment all along. Inside the house, on Sarah's kitchen counter, sat an official letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, offering her a position as a K-9 handler specializing in trauma-informed victim advocacy. The salary was less than her police pension. The benefits were different. The work would be harder in ways she couldn't yet fully anticipate. But it would matter. It would mean something. And perhaps most importantly, it would allow her to stop running from the thing that had defined her life, the need to help, the drive to protect, the understanding that some callings couldn't be retired from, no matter how much you wanted them to end. Because Sarah Chen had discovered something that nobody expected when they'd celebrated her retirement 6 weeks ago, that the most important endings are often disguised as new beginnings, and that sometimes the only way to finally rest is to find a different kind of work worth doing. Epilogue 6 months later. The training facility outside Denver was quiet on Sunday mornings. Sarah and Duke moved through the obstacle course with the practiced ease of partners who'd been working together long enough that language had become almost unnecessary. The dog bounded over barriers, navigated through mock crime scenes, responded to Sarah's hand signals with the precision of an animal operating at the height of his abilities. But the course was different now, gentler somehow, less about detection and more about presence, less about identifying threats and more about providing comfort. At the end of the course, a young girl waited, not Maya, but another child, a 7-year-old named Priya who'd been found in a basement similar to Holland's and was working with Dr. Kovac's team to reintegrate back into normal life. When Priya saw Duke, her entire face transformed. "Police dog," she whispered, the same words Maya had spoken months ago. And Duke, understanding his role perfectly, lowered his massive head to the child's level and let her touch him, let her feel the warmth of another being who'd survived darkness and come back to light. Sarah watched from a distance, documenting the interaction, understanding that this was work, real work, important work. The work that retirement had been waiting for all along.